Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who teach on campus at Dayspring. If you teach a small group to students or adults, this video is designed to help you get ready for the lesson that you're going to teach on May the 18th. So you should have your teaching transcript already. Go ahead and grab that. Let's look at it together. I'm going to walk through it with you, give you some thoughts I have along the way. Maybe it'll help you get ready to teach the lesson on May the 18th. Get that transcript out and let's look at it together. On page 1, you have your overview page, and that's the lesson overview. That's not something that you teach. That's just to acquaint you with what this lesson is all about. And you're going to see that this lesson, as you read through that, this lesson is about the connection between truth and love. And you're going to show throughout this lesson that those two things were really made to go together and, in fact, cannot be severed. If it's really going to be truth or it's really going to be love, it has to be accompanied by the other, or it really is not truth or love. Now, one statement for you to keep in mind throughout this lesson, and it's something that we've talked about already in this series, keep in mind the statement that true love is a reflection of the nature and character of God. That's something that I said back in the second sermon in this series. True love is a reflection of the character and nature of God. If it's not a reflection of the character and nature of God, then though it may call itself love, it's really not. And this is why love cannot be severed from truth. If you find something that calls itself love, but it's disconnected from truth, then it's not really love. And here's what you're going to find out in this lesson, that the inverse is also true. That which we talk about as truth, if there's no connection to love, then that truth needs to be questioned as authentic truth. So in this lesson, we're going to be talking about the connection between truth and love and how they go together. So flip on over to page 2. This is where you start teaching the lesson. Now, on page 2, what you find here is an illustration about how some things just go together. And the illustration, this is kind of an icebreaker illustration for you. This illustration talks about how certain foods are brought together. But, you know, we all have certain quirky things that we like to eat. We put them together, and there are certain things that we might eat. We don't even tell other people about it because we know this is just kind of weird. And in this illustration, it draws on the life of Elvis Presley, who was known, who made it known that he loved peanut butter and banana sandwiches. I mean, he had them all the time, and he even had variations of this. That page 2 talks about some of that, and there's some fun information about that. But he had these kind of sandwiches that he liked to eat, and for him, those things just went together. What you might do in sharing this illustration, really get people to share their quirky dietary routines and maybe even share yours. This can be a really fun opener. But the whole point, which is spelled out actually on page 3, the whole point, it says at the top, it says there are some things, and this is page 3, there are some things that when paired together, they really make you scratch your head. And today we're going to look at a couple of things that should go together, but oftentimes we don't see how they can or should. And we're talking about truth and love. Truth and love were made to go together, but sometimes we don't really think of it that way. So that's the lesson that you're going to be teaching. You can use the fun food illustration to get at all of that. Now you're going to start teaching the actual Bible lesson on page 4. Check this out. This is a 3-point lesson. You've got 3 primary points that you're going to make as to how truth and love go together so well and what happens when they do go together. So those are the 3 things that you're really pointing out. Let's look at them together one at a time. I'm not going to really elaborate on a lot of this because your transcript's going to do it for you. But here's some things to think about. On page 4, number 1, truth and love fuel one another. That's the first way. Now, if you look there, you're instructed to read 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 22 and 23. And I want you to listen to this, and I want you to pay attention to the nuance of some of the wording here. And again, we're talking about the connection of truth and love and how they fuel one another. Listen to these words from 1 Peter chapter 1. It says, now that you have purified yourselves by obeying the truth, now that you've done that, listen to this. Now that you've purified yourselves by obeying the truth so that you have sincere love for your brothers, love one another deeply from the heart. Now, isn't that interesting? Now that you have given yourself to the truth so that you can love one another, do you see how love is fueled by the truth? It goes on to say in verse 23, "For you've been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and enduring word of God." Now, I really want you to, as you prepare for this lesson, look at those two verses and really chew on the wording there. Look at the phrasing and look at how these things go together, truth and love, and how they fuel one another. And by the way, something that you're going to need to do in this lesson, because you're going to be teaching from 3 different passages in the Bible as you make these 3 individual points, there's a great teaching tip there on page 4 that you don't need to ignore. It talks about understanding context when you teach something. Since you're going to be teaching this little snippet here and this little snippet here and this little snippet here, what I would encourage you to do is to do a lot of extra reading this week from the surrounding verses from the passage you're going to be teaching. Gain the greater context. So when you teach this lesson, and you're going to be teaching 1 Peter chapter 1 verses 22 and 23 here, don't just read those 2 verses in preparation for this lesson. Read all of chapter 1, see how it flows into chapter 2. Learn the context, okay? Learn the context. So you need to do a lot of extra Bible reading this week as you get ready to teach these particular passages. But the point here, in this particular point that you're making, and on page 4, the point here is that our embracing of the truth, it teaches us to truly love. When we embrace the truth, all of a sudden, authentic love is something that we know how to do, and in fact, it's something that we want to do. And when we start to do true love, when we exercise it, as it's been revealed to us by the truth of Scripture, when we begin to do authentic love, all of a sudden that also creates a greater love and intensity for the truth. So they fuel one another in that way. And that's really the point that you're making here in that 1 Peter passage, 1 Peter chapter 1 passage helps you do that. Now that brings you to the second major point you're making, and that's on page 5, okay? Page 5. Here's the second one. Truth and love validate one another. So your first point was that truth and love fuel one another, but now you're saying that truth and love validate one another. And there's much that can be said here, and the wording can be a little tricky. It can lead you to sound like you're saying something that you're not, so let's make sure that we're clear on that. And look at your transcript, because I am going to read you a bit of what is said here on page 5. You're going to read 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 through 18 in this. And this is a passage that will sound vaguely familiar to you as someone who's been teaching through some of these lessons, especially as we did 1 John recently. But 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 through 18, I want to read these to you. Here's what it says. It says, "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. Now, if anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need, but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth." Now, here's what was going on in John's particular context here. John saw people who had great need. Then John saw people who were believers in Jesus, confessed faith in Jesus, who had a lot. And in John's mind, it made no sense how somebody who loved Jesus and who had a lot, who could just watch somebody struggle and go without and really not care. That didn't make sense for John. So John admonishes them with the words in verse 18, "Let us not love only with our words, but in action and in truth." Very, very important there that John is making the connection that love and action go together. Now, what we're saying here is that they validate one another, and this necessitates some clarification on your part, because here's what we're saying. Look at the bottom of page 5. This is really important. That last paragraph. It says, "Let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that truth is dependent upon any outward source in order to make it true. The only source that verifies truth in and of itself is God. I'm not saying that truth needs love in order to be true or valid." Now you say, what does that mean? Here's what it means. If I make the truth statement that Jesus is Lord, that statement is true. Regardless of how I act from here out, regardless of what I do to you after I make that statement is true. So to say that love validates truth it doesn't mean that I have to do something loving or else what I say isn't factually true. If I said 2 plus 2 is 4, that's going to be true regardless of what I do in and out, outside of that statement. So I'm not saying that truth is validated by love in that way. You say, well, what are you saying then? Well, look at page 6. This clears it up at the very top. It says, what I'm trying to say is this, that oftentimes truth needs love in order to be received as valid. Now that makes sense, right? Truth and love validate one another. If I tell you something that is true, but I act like an absolute jerk in the process, you probably don't care what I have to say. True? But if I'm kind and I'm patient and I'm all of those things that love really is, and if I'm not rude and I'm not self-seeking, I mean, if you knew me to be that kind of person, now all of a sudden you're going to give me a listening ear when I'm trying to present what I would describe as truth. And by the way, there is a great illustration of this that's going to surface in the group handout. So you don't necessarily have to exhaust this one fully, because when your group gets into clusters and works through the handout together, on that second point, there's a great illustration about this that equates evangelism as making a withdrawal at the bank. Truth and love validate one another in that way. Truth is validated by love in the sense that love needs to be present if people are going to pay attention to what I have to say. It's interesting. I saw a debate recently between an atheist and a Christian, and it was interesting reading some of the blogosphere response to it, because some, you always have these people who say, well, I think this person won the debate or this person won the debate. There were some who declared that they thought that the atheist won the debate, and it's funny because their rationale, listen to this, they said they thought that he won the debate, and basically it's because they said that he was more winsome. It was because of the way that he came across. Now, isn't that funny? Both guys are presenting information. Both of them think they're presenting the truth, but some people were saying, well, I really wanted to hear what this guy had to say because of the way that he came across. So when we say that truth is validated by love, that's what we mean. Now you say, well, what about the opposite when we say that love is validated by truth? Here's something that you can explore to help you understand that, because somebody might ask you that question. Really what I've focused on here is how our truth is validated by love, but we are making the case that love is also validated by truth. So if somebody says, what does that mean, or what do you mean by that? Here's a good illustration of that. Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, Jesus talks about, he uses the illustration about trying to tell somebody they've got something in their eye, like a speck of sawdust, when you've got a big plank in your own eye. And Jesus basically says, how do you expect somebody to let you take the speck of dust out of their eye when you're walking around with a big plank hanging out of your own? That's a good illustration of what we're talking about here, because if we claim to be the people who understand true love, now if we as believers claim to be people who understand true love, then people are going to have to see us living consistently in the truth. My actions are going to have to be consistently in keeping with the precepts of Scripture and the way of God and the nature of God. In other words, if I'm walking around with this big sinful plank out of my eye, yet I'm the one claiming to understand what love is, that's really what we mean when we say that love is validated by truth. We have to be walking in truth if our message of love is going to be received. So that's discussion point number 2, that truth and love validate each other. I hope that all makes sense now, okay? I didn't cover a lot, by the way, that's in your transcript. So now here's the third point. Bottom of page 6. Speaking the truth in love grows the church. That's the third point that you're making. We've talked about how truth and love fuel one another. That's how they go together. We've talked about how truth and love validate one another. That's how they go together. Now we're saying that when we speak the truth in love, that a byproduct is that the church grows. You're going to read Ephesians chapter 4. Look at your transcript. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. And here's what those verses are about. I'm not going to read them to you. But Ephesians talks about how the church can be blown around like, just the wind is blowing us every which direction. It says, therefore, we need to speak the truth in love to one another. Now, as you flip on over to page 7, this whole point is, detailed for you. It's pretty self-explanatory, but the thought process is this. Growth is a good thing. We would all agree on that, right? Growth is good. Growth is the equivalent of change. You see something growing, that means it changes. So growth is good, therefore change is good. Why do we need to change? We need to change because we're not complete. Now, when we're talking in terms of spiritual things, we need to change because sin is present in our lives. So because sin is present in our lives, you know what we need? We need the truth spoken to us. We need truth to come into our lives. So think about this. When truth is spoken between believers, that's a good thing because that's how growth happens, and we know that growth is good. So what you're going to look at here on page 7, you're just simply asking the question, since we know that the truth needs to be spoken to one another because growth is a good thing that we desire to see, how does love fit into that equation? What does it look like when truth is spoken in love? And here's what I would encourage you to do as the teacher. As you prepare to teach through this, you're thinking about truth and love and how truth needs to be spoken in love. Think of it in these terms. Go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 and 5, which is what we've been learning in Big Church for the last couple of weeks, where love is patient, love is kind, it's not rude, it's not self-seeking, all of these things that we've been looking at. Think about this whole concept of speaking the truth to one another in a way that is reflective of what we hear in those 1 Corinthians verses. So when we're saying, what does it look like when we speak the truth, which we need to do, we've got to speak the truth to each other because that's how we're going to grow. But if we're going to do that in love, what's that going to look like? So run that through the filter of 1 Corinthians 13, 4 and 5 and see what you think speaking the truth in love might look like. And that might even be a question that you throw out to your group as you're making this third point. What does speaking the truth in love look like? And let's look at it through the filter of 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 and 5. And you may discover that some people have been learning some things along the way about love and what it is and what it's not and what it does and what it doesn't do. All right, so that's the lesson that you're going to be teaching. At the very bottom of page 7, there's a great summary statement. And you can make it. I would actually say it exactly like this. So, love and truth go together like peanut butter and bananas, right? Just like Elvis. They fuel one another, they validate one another, and when truth is spoken in love, God's people grow into a greater representation of Christ. So, you've taught through the lesson. At this point, you move into the group handouts. Look at page 8 and page 10. Page 10 is your actual handout. Look at it and look at these things that it talks through. These are 3 great discussion points, and your group should have no problem working through these together. So whatever you do this week, don't get bogged down in the lecture time. Leave space here. Make sure that your group has time to break into clusters and work through these handouts together. And as always, you always see this on page 8 in your transcript. Maybe it's been on there too much that you don't even notice it anymore, but I encourage you to maybe pawn this part of your lesson off to somebody that you're kind of discipling and growing as maybe a future teacher. Let them handle this group handout part. Let them distribute it. Let them facilitate the discussion at the end of it and all of that. But your group handout's got 3 great discussion points on them. And here's what I would encourage you to do this week. As you prepare to teach, go ahead and take this group handout and work through it on your own. Just go ahead and work through this. Read these things. Let your wheels get spinning as you read through this, because I think you're going to see how this is going to be a great discussion point for your group, and how when they get to discussing these things together, your folks are going to learn some stuff about how we need to do love and what it needs to look like as Christ ambassadors on this earth. So you've got 3 great discussion points there. Let them work through that. Once they've done that, you're going to wrap the lesson up. You've got a quaint little conclusion there on page 9. And on that conclusion, you've got the weekly memory verse. And in finishing your lesson, look at the teaching tip on page 9, okay? If you haven't read that in a while, go ahead and read that teaching tip. It gives you some great advice on how to conclude your teaching time and your lesson time, all right? So that's what this week's lesson is all about. Truth and love, they go together. Just like Elvis would say, peanut butter and bananas go together. truth and love go together. And the reality is that when we have truth that's severed from love, it's an incomplete truth. And when we have love that's severed from truth, then it's really not even love. Both of these things go together, and hopefully you'll be able to make that point and show how as you teach through this lesson this week. Hey, God bless you. May we continue to grow in this love revolution together. God bless you as you teach your lesson this Sunday. We'll see you then.